Welcome back to Blender. This week we're going to be talking about the Eevee render engine. So first things first, what you want to do is come up here and swap this from Cycles to Eevee. Now in the color management, which is down pretty low in the series, very bottom, you want to go to the View Transform and you're going to change it from Filmic to Standard. And for the look, we'll just do medium contrast. Of course you can play with this, but I'm just going to leave it on these settings for us, and it should make the colors a little more vibrant on the screen. I'll add a light into the scene. I'll just do a point light. Nothing too wild at this point in the process, but I will go ahead and increase its power. And I'll swap into render view so we can see this in action. Okay, and this will be what we're going to use initially. I'll decrease that a bit here. I'm just playing with numbers to get an initial setup so we can see what the settings are going to be changing as we're changing them. You don't need to necessarily do this yourself, but you can follow along, and I hope it will help you understand what we're going to be looking at today. Here in the Eevee settings, you'll notice a number of tabs that are pretty self-explanatory. And the first one we'll talk about is the Shadows tab. And this will make a bigger difference on the Toonshaders especially, but you'll notice here there's a number for cube size and cascade size, and these will directly impact the resolution of your shadows. Eevee is a real-time renderer, so you'll see that it is rendering immediately, but the quality is lower because it's skipping steps in calculating the lighting. So what you would be doing here is devoting more resources to those calculations. Cube size is the size of the shadow map texture, which is where the shadow is temporarily being mapped onto the surface. Just upping this cube size immediately sharpens that shadow out. Here you'll see that at 64, you'll notice the immediate difference to swapping it up to 4096. And similarly, the cascade size is some additional shadow resolution. So now this shadow is still real time, but it is a perfect shadow. Now you can enable soft shadows, which you'll see it starts to break a little here, because to soften it, it has multiple layers and they're translucently overlaid. And while they are sharp, of course, it's still imperfect. So for what we're going to be doing today, I think you'll find that soft shadows off is much more pleasant. But similarly, if you want to increase that, you can increase the radius on your light or the angle of the sun in the scene. And you'll notice that as the light softens and the shadows get softer, it breaks more planes out into the scene. So it's not always good necessarily, but like I said, for what we're going to be doing, I'll be reducing the radius on my lights, and I will be unchecking the soft shadows because we want pretty crispy shadows. Now if you look closely, you'll see there are still some imperfections in this calculation, and there's not really a ton you can do about that, and that's just going to be one of those limitations, and it will be based a lot off of the amount of lighting in the scene and the position of the lights, so just be aware of that. Now some other pretty nice settings that are available here in the Eevee engine. So beyond the shadows, you'll find that the sampling will also help increase the resolution. Now this will mean that the render time will actually increase. So if you increase this high enough, it will no longer be real-time rendering. You can play around with this. In general, you may not actually need to change these numbers at all. But for example, if I change the viewport to 64, you can't even see the difference in the viewport of what is rendering. But if we start upping this number really high, I don't know, 256 isn't really even that high, but if we go to 4096, which is like what Cycles is oftentimes rendering in, it can start to slow it down. Here, because this scene is very simple, it's not really having any troubles either though. I would actually just, for the most part, leave these alone until you might see there's some issues in your rendering later. And that way, in that point, you might up this to 256 or something. But some other pretty nice settings that are available here are things like the ambient occlusion, and you'll mouse over, you'll be able to read what it does, and it says the distance of object that contribute to the ambient occlusion effect. And the ambient occlusion is going to bounce the lighting and give things edge shadowing, and essentially it's just going to make it look a little better. It will clean the images up. And again, all of these settings that you start to activate will potentially slow the rendering process down. Here I have a material on this plane. I'm going to add just a diffuse because I don't like this reflection I'm getting. The ambient occlusion will make it look better, and bloom is glow. So here it's hard to tell with this current setup, but it becomes much more obvious if you up the intensity and have more lights in the scene. So there you see exactly what the bloom is doing as I cranked it 0.05, which was the default, and now it's got a pretty comfortable anime glow in there. But you will probably find that you want some bloom in the scene. It tends to make things look a little better actually. So I will actually leave this on in my settings, but that's up to you. Now you'll find that there are some additional settings here, and if you aren't moving your lights at all in the scene, you can go through and do what's called baking your lighting. And essentially what that does is, here where this light is dynamically moving, that is very expensive because every time the light changes position, the software has to recalculate where the shadow is. And if the lighting is not baked, it will be recalculating it every frame for your animation. What you can do is you can up the resolution of the cube maps, and then you can bake the lighting. And essentially all that does is it temporarily stores the shadows on the texture file itself, and so it's much cheaper for the computer to render out your shadows. You may want to do this later, but I'm not going to be doing this for it because the scene and the toon shaders are light enough where this won't be a problem, but you can play around with that if you want. Now, there are some additional settings for depth of field, which can give you some higher resolution depth of field effects and everything, but you can also do that in the camera. This is like a post filter on it. You can add in effects like motion blur, and if you have a volumetric fog in the scene, you may want to play around with this because decreasing the pixel count here actually increases the fog resolution, but you don't necessarily need to do that. Now, you're already very familiar with the film settings, which you can leave it as transparent background or not, it's up to you. Some of the settings we'll be talking about later are potentially the grease pencil and the freestyle. But all in all, I really would recommend just digging into these. You'll find that while cycles can, of course, make things look good very easily, innately, and you don't have to really play with the settings very much, you'll find that playing with the settings in Eevee will yield amazing results quickly. And some of it will just be, again, experimentation. So I highly recommend you play around with that. In the next video, I'm going to go through how to set up a basic toon shader.